Okay, welcome back to Tools of Quantitative Research. So today we will discuss about the research instrument and then we will focus on the interview, specifically on the interview schedule and the question. So research instrument. So the first module we will discuss on interview schedule. So as we all know that the interview schedule is a written list of questions. It could be open-ended or closed-ended questions, and it is prepared for use by an interviewer. It could be an in person-to-person interaction or face-to-face, and this could be again face-to-face or by telephone or by other electronic media. So when we talk about interview schedule, it is a research tool or instrument for collecting data. And whereas when we talk about interviewing is a method of data collection, so we will discuss this one later on as we go along. And of course, second module is we will talk about questionnaire. What is questionnaire all about? And specifically, it is a written list of questions and the answers to which are recorded by respondents. And of course, in a questionnaire, respondents read the questions, interpret what is expected, and then write down the answers. So again, these are recorded by respondents and as well as interviewers who will conduct the questionnaire. So the questionnaire is a tool, also a written list of questions intended for your respondents. Okay. Alright, in this scenario, we can see that the interviewer is conducting the interview. So for the respondent, and they have a one-on-one discussion, and maybe it's related to the data that the interviewer wanted to ask for specific information to the respondent or the subject itself. Interviewing is a commonly used method of collecting information from people. According to Monet et al. In 1986, an interview involves interviewer reading questions to respondents and recording their answers. According to Burns in 1997, an interview is a verbal interchange, often face-to-face, though a telephone may be used, in which an interviewer tries to elicit information, belief, or opinions from another person. An interview is any person-to-person interaction, either face-to-face or between two or more individuals with a specific purpose in mind. An interview is a data collection technique that involves verbal questioning of respondents. So as I mentioned earlier, that interviewing is a method of data collection. So when interviewing a respondent, you as a researcher have the freedom to decide that specifically for the format and content of questions to be asked to your respondents. So you select the wording of your questions and you decide the way you want to ask to them. And also you choose the order in which they are to be asked. So this process of asking questions can either very flexible, where you are as the interviewer has the freedom to think about and also to formulate questions as they come to your mind around the issue being investigated, or inflexible, where you have to keep strictly to the questions decided beforehand, including their wording. specifically also the sequence and the manner in which they are being asked. So again, you are collecting information from your respondents or subjects. Interviews are classified into different categories according to the degree of flexibility. So we have types of interview. So the first type of the interview is what we know as structured interview. This is also known as your standard interview. So researchers ask a predetermined set of questions using the same wording and order of questions as specified in the interview schedule. It provides also uniform information in the same order. So one of the main advantages of the structured interview is that it provides uniform information, which assures the comparability of study. And also in structured interviewing, this requires fewer interviewing skills than that with the structured interviewing. And as we all know that it is the researcher asks a standard set of questions and also it follows a specific format with the same line of questioning. This also aims to ensure that each interview is presented with exactly the same questions in the same order. So meaning to say that you have a guide question. So in the structured interview, it is a prevalent in both the qualitative and the quantitative research. So a complete freedom they provide in terms of content and structure. So depends on the response of the interviewer. There's no guide questions, and you also have a complete freedom in terms of the wording you use and the way you explain questions to your respondents. But in this structured interview, this is dominantly used by if you have the qualitative research. So meaning to say that in most complete freedom, you provide in terms of the content and structure, meaning you are free to order this in whatever sequence you wish, and you also have a complete freedom in terms of the wording you use and the way you explain questions to your respondents. So meaning you can formulate easily questions, and you can also raise issues at the moment, and as well as depending upon what it occurs during your discussion. So in the unstructured interviews, the difference is in how information obtained through them in response to your questions is likely to be used. In quantitative research, you develop response categorizations from responses, which are then coded and quantified. In qualitative research, the responses are used as descriptors, often in verbatim form, and can be integrated with your arguments, flow of writing, and sequence of logic. So as the unstructured interviews are dominantly used in qualitative research. So as we go along, you will know about this one because we will discuss also the questionnaire. So in this sense, it is likely that there's no guide question for this, and you can also ask you have the freedom to ask to your respondents. This is what we know as unstructured interview. Other types of interview. So we have here face-to-face interview. This is the most frequently used method and enables to gain trust and confidence. It has a high response rate and can verify ambiguous answers and can ask other information. So there is also direct personal interview and can ask one-on-one, or it is a one-on-one. You can ask directly or by groups. And also you have indirect personal interview, this interviewing by third person who are directly or indirectly has knowledge with the respondents' queries and as informants, or informants that will help in collecting related data. So in this face-to-face interview, um, this method vary from in-depth or unstructured, or what we know as semi-structured. So like for example, in the structured questions without response codes, so methods to highly structured pre-coded response questionnaires, or they can involve a combination of two, which is the structured pre-coded questionnaire but with open-ended questions to allow the respondent to rely in his or her own words, where the range of responses is unknown or cannot be easily categorized. Sometimes measurement instruments are handed to the respondents, like the self-completion or self-administration scales, to complete themselves during face-to-face interview. So just like for scales of depression, where it is thought that the interviewer recording of the response may lead to social desirability bias. So the advantages of face-to-face interviews are interviewers can probe fully for responses and clarify any ambiguities, because you can directly ask in person, no, to the respondent, and more complicated and detailed questions can be also asked, and more information, and you can gather more information as well of greater depth and can be obtained. Inconsistencies and misinterpretations can be checked because you can verify immediately, and there are no literacy requirements for respondents. And also questions in structured schedules can be asked in a predetermined order. So response rate are generally higher with friendly interviewers than for questionnaires which are sent through the post or telephone interviews. So specifically, if you have a well-trained interviewer, and open-ended questions can be included in the questionnaire to enable respondents to give their opinions in full or in more complex topics, and they can expound their answers also. And they also provide rich and quotable material which enlevens research reports, and open-ended questions are used for topics which are largely unknown or complex and for pilot studies. But the potential errors made by interviewers is by making incorrect skips of inapplicable questions and sub-questions, and also can be minimized by computer-assisted interviewing, like with the use of laptop or your computers to display also the questionnaire, which enable respondents and also replies to be directly key in which automatically display the next question, and you can skip or errors and so on. So the disadvantage are the interviewers can be expensive and time consuming, and there is a potential for interviewer bias and additional bias if interpreters are used for some participants. Techniques for reducing potential bias include good interviewer training and methods of establishing rapport with people or putting them at ease and appearing non-judgmental. So interviewers can also be matched with participants in relation to their basic social demographic characteristics, though in practice the availability of potential interviewers rules out matching on a large scale, and there is a little consistent information about reduction of response biases through matching, and structured and semi-structured interview questionnaires, if fully designed for the specific topic, can yield accurate method. In the sense that, however, the topic has to be appropriate for this method, and unstructured interview methods are more appropriate for complex and unknown issues. So despite despite the popularity of using face-to-face interview methods for health surveys, there is also increasing evidence that these methods lead to underreporting of health problems, and as well as in comparison with postal approaches, particularly for mental health topics, probably due to the operation of social desirability bias in the former situation. But this is according to Bowling in et al. In 1991. So that is one way also to determine the advantages and disadvantages of this face-to-face. Another type is the telephone interview. Telephone interview may be biased and less time-consuming and less expensive, and questions can be asked by phone. Outbound calling respondents to answer like a survey, and random telephone calls to prospect respondents. So in the telephone interviews conducted by telephone appear to have equal accuracy rates than with the face-to-face interviews in relation to the collection of data in general health status and the prevalence of depressive symptoms. So their main advantage is that in theory the method is economic in relation to time because there's no traveling involved for the interviewer. And of course, you can have this save in resources because traveling and associated costs are also not incurred. And however, this telephone interviewing is not necessarily a cheap option. And at least 3 callbacks will be required, and giving estimates that 50% of dialing are met with the engaged tone or there is no reply. An increasing number of telephones have answering systems, and answering systems tend to be held by younger, unmarried people in higher socioeconomic groups. And this necessitates repeated callbacks, which can be time consuming. If sampling bias is to be minimized, there is the potential bias of over-representing people who are most likely to be at home, and specifically who answer the telephone, who may be unrepresented of the wider population. So this is one way also, because sometimes the one that you talk in the telephone is not around, and that's why someone is answering the question in his or her behalf. So that is potential for sample bias. So the main disadvantage of this method is that the only suitable for use is the use of questionnaires and or non-sensitive topics, with higher rates of total and item non-response in health surveys. So specifically if the topic is very sensitive, so that's why they are very hesitant also to answer. It could be a survey, or it could be other questions related to health and issues who are very sensitive to tell about, so they are also hesitant, and the more that they will not answer. So there will be possible later on that there will be possible bias that may come in. Specifically, some evidence that people prefer personal interviews than with the telephone interviews. So they wanted to be in person. So that's the advantages and disadvantages of having telephone interviews, and as well as other types of interviews. So an interview schedule is a written list of questions. It could be open-ended or closed-ended questions, and prepared for use by an interviewer in a person-to-person interaction, or it could be a face-to-face or by telephone or other electronic media. So the advantages of this interview schedule or interview are as follows. We have here through personal interview, because it usually yields much better information on the sample population compared to questionnaires. And also number 2 is the interview is more flexible. If the respondent misunderstands a question, then the interviewer can explain it, because you can ask ambiguity, and for clarification you can ask directly, and you can explain also directly from the respondent, so he can also paraphrase the question or the answer. You can paraphrase the answer of the respondent. And third is the interviewer not only listens to what the respondent is saying, but also observes how he says it. If he wishes to, the interviewer can make a follow-up to a question, then thereby obtaining more in-depth information and context. So fourth is the interview is more appropriate in revealing information about complex and emotionally um, topics through probe questions. So you can prove, proving is also one way for you to gather more information from your respondents. So this interview schedule is necessary for us, specifically if you are a researcher. Then if you want to gather the exact information, then it could be a face-to-face or by telephone or electronic. Then this written list of questions you'll be using for this in order to directly ask, and you can also ask directly from your respondent, and also you can probe, or you can ask probing questions in order to make a follow-up if there's a clarification on the information was being delivered from your respondents or subject. Interview schedule. It is a research tool or instrument for collecting data. It is also a set of questions, but the questions are want to be asked by the interviewers. So interview schedule is your written questions to be administered to your respondents. Advantages of the interview. Number one is the interview is more appropriate for complex situations. So in the sense that it is the most appropriate approach for studying complex and sensitive areas, as the interviewer has the opportunity to prepare a respondent before asking sensitive questions, and to explain complex ones to respondents in person. The second advantage of the interview is it is useful for collecting in-depth information. So in an interview situation, it is possible for an investigator to obtain in-depth information by probing. Hence, in situations where in-depth information is required, interviewing is preferred method of data collection. Third is information can be supplemented. An interviewer is able to supplement information obtained from responses with those gained from observation of nonverbal reactions. And we have also fourth advantage is questions can be explained. So it is less likely that a question will be misunderstood, as the interviewer can either repeat the question or put it in a form that is understood by the respondent. And lastly is interviewing has a wider application. So an interviewer can be used with almost any type of population. Just like, for example, we have children, the handicapped, the illiterate, or very old. So because you can directly ask the question in person. And what are the disadvantages of this interview? Number one, we have interviewing is time consuming and expensive. So this is especially so when potential respondents are scattered over a wide geographical area. However, if you have a situation such as an office or a hospital or an agency where potential respondents come to obtain a service, then interviewing them in that setting may be less expensive and less time consuming. Now, the second disadvantage of the use of the interview is the quality of data depends upon the quality of the interaction. In an interview, the quality of interaction between an interviewer and the interviewee is likely to affect the quality of the information obtained. Also, because the interaction in each interview is unique, so the quality of the responses obtained from different interviews may vary significantly. Another one is the quality of data depends upon the quality of the interviewer. So in an interview situation, the quality of the data generated is affected by the experience, skills and commitment of the interviewer. And we have also fourth is the quality of data may vary when many interviewers are used. So use of multiple interviewers may magnify the problems identified in the two previous points. And lastly is the researcher may introduce his or her bias. So researcher bias in the framing of questions and the interpretation of responses is always possible. If the interviews are conducted by a person or persons, paid or voluntary, other than the researcher, it is also possible that they may exhibit bias in the way they interpret responses, select response categories, or choose words to summarize respondents' expressed opinions. So these are all the advantages and disadvantages of the interview. To draw a clear distinction between quantitative and qualitative methods of data collection is both difficult and inappropriate because of the overlap between them. So the difference between them mainly lies in the manner in which a method is applied in an actual data collection situation. So use of these methods in quantitative research demands standardization of questions to be asked of the respondents, so a rigid adherence to their structure and order, and adoption of a process that is tested and predetermined, and making sure of the validity and reliability of the process as well as the questions. However, the methods of data collection in qualitative research follow on the convention, which is almost opposite to quantitative research. Whereas in qualitative methods are flexible, and there is characterized by flexibility and as well as freedom in terms of structure and order given to the researcher. So as mentioned by the previous chapter, so most qualitative study designs are method based. So that is, the method of data collection seems to determine the design. In some situations, it becomes difficult to separate a study design from the method of data collection. So for example, in depth interviewing, narratives and oral history are both designs and methods of data collection. This may confuse some, but here they are detailed as methods and not designs. So what are the three main methods of data collection and qualitative research? So we have unstructured interviews, and we have also participant observation. So we are done with this one in the previous module about observation, and also secondary sources. So we will tackle this one as the methods of data collection and qualitative research. So as we all know, in the participant observation, it has been adequately covered on the previous module. And also this time we will focus first on the structured and unstructured interviews. So flexibility, freedom, and spontaneity in contents and structure underpin an interaction in all types of unstructured interview. This interaction can be at the one-to-one, or meaning researcher and a respondent, or a group, meaning researcher and a group of respondents level. So there are also several types of unstructured interview that are prevalent in qualitative research. So what are those? That would be in-depth interviewing, focus group interviewing, narratives, and oral histories. So we will discuss this one on the next slide. Alright, we are here on the types of unstructured interviews. So there are four types. We have the in-depth interviews, we have also focus group interviews, we have narratives and oral histories. So number one is in-depth interview. So the theoretical roots of this in-depth interviewing are in what is known as the interpretive tradition. So according to Taylor and Bogdan, in-depth interviewing is repeated face-to-face encounters between the researcher and informants directed towards understanding informants' perspective on their lives, experiences, or situations as expressed in their own words. It was in 1998. So this definition underlines two essential characteristics of in-depth interviewing. So number one, it involves face-to-face, repeated interaction between the researcher and his or her informant. And second, it seeks to understand the latter's perspective because this method involves repeated contacts and hence an extended length of time spent with an informant. It is assumed that the rapport between researcher and the informant will be enhanced and that the corresponding understanding and confidence between the two will lead to in-depth and accurate information. The second one is the focus group interviews. So the only difference between a focus group interview and in-depth interview is that the former is undertaken with a group and the latter with an individual. In a focus group interview, you explore the perceptions, experiences, and understandings of a group of people who have some experience in common with regard to a situation or event. So for example, you may explore with relevant groups such as issues as domestic violence, physical disability, or refugees. So in focus group interviews, there is broad discussion topics are involved beforehand. So either by the researcher or by the group. These provide a broad frame for discussions which follow. The specific discussion points emerge as a part of the discussion. So members of a focus group express their opinions while discussing these issues. So you as a researcher need to ensure that whatever is expressed or discussed is recorded accurately. So meaning word for word. Yeah? So use the method of recording that suits you the best. So you may audio tape discussions, employ someone else to record them, or record them yourself immediately after each session. So if you're taking your own notes during a discussions, then you need to be carefully not to lose something of importance because of your involvement in discussions. So you can and should take your write-up on discussions back up to your focus group for correction, for verification also, and for confirmation. The third type of the unstructured interview is what we know as narratives. So the narrative technique of gathering information has even less structure than the focus group. So narratives have almost no predetermined contents except that the researcher seeks to hear a person's retelling of an incident or happening in his or her life. So essentially, the person tells his or her story about the incident or situation, and you as the researcher listen positively or passively. So you need to listen passively, and of course, occasionally you encourage the individual by using active listening skills or techniques. That is, say words such as yeah, then right, and not as appropriate. So basically, you let the person talk freely and without interrupting. So narratives are a very powerful method of data collection for situations which are sensitive in nature. So for example, you may want to find out about the impact of child sexual abuse or the people who have gone through such experience. When you as a researcher ask these people to narrate their experiences and how they have been affected. So narratives may have a therapeutic impact. That is, sometimes simply telling their story may help a people or a person or to feel more at ease with the event. No? But some therapies specialize in narrative therapy. But here, we are concerned with narratives as a method of data collection. So as with focus group interviews, you need to choose the recording system that suits you the best. And having completed narrative sessions, you need to write your detailed notes and give them back to the respondent to check for accuracy. And last but not the least is your oral histories. What is oral histories? So it's just like in narratives, it involves the use of both passive and active listening. Oral histories, however, are more commonly used for learning about historical event or episode that took place in the past, or for gaining information about a cultural custom or story that has been passed from generation to generation. So narratives are more about a person's personal experiences, whereas historical, social, or cultural events are the subjects for or of oral histories. So suppose you want to find out about the life after the Second World War. So specifically in some regional town, specifically here in Philippines, no? You need to ask about that one. What are their experiences during the World War II? So you can ask them, those who are experienced with this kind of chaos or problems or chaotic experiences, or they have bad experiences before. So you would talk to persons who were alive during that period and ask them about life at that time. So data collection through unstructured interviewing is extremely useful in situations where either in-depth information is needed or little is known about the area. So the flexibility allowed to the interviewer in what or he or she is asking of to the respondent is an asset, as it can elicit extremely rich information, as it provides in-depth information. So this technique is used by many researchers for constructing a structured research instrument. So on the other hand, since an unstructured interview, this unstructured interview does not list specific questions to be asked of respondents. So the comparability of questions asked and responses obtained may become a problem. So as the researcher gains experience during the interviews, the questions asked of respondents change. So hence the type of information obtained from those who are interviewed at the beginning may be different from that obtained from those interviewed towards the end. Also, this freedom can introduce investigator bias into the study. So using an interview guide as a means of data collection requires more skill on the part of the researcher than thus using a structured interview. So let's discuss on collecting data using secondary sources. So there are four categories in using the secondary sources. So this is from the government or semi-government publications. And you can either get the source from earlier research, it could be personal records, or mass media. So in this data we're in, both qualitative and quantitative research studies uses secondary sources as a method of data collection. So in the qualitative research, you usually extract descriptive, or what we know as historical and current, and narrative information. And in quantitative research, the information extracted is in categorical or numerical. So these are the following. So we have here, the first one is government or semi-government publications. So there are many government and semi-government organizations that collect data on a regular basis in a variety of areas and publish it for use by members of the public and interest groups. So some common examples are the census, vital statistics, registration, labor force surveys, health reports, economic forecast, and demographic information. Another one is the earlier research. So for some topics, an enormous number of research studies that have already been done by others can provide you with the required information. So you can search this one. Now, there are lots of sources here, mostly from previous research, earlier research. You can access that one. You can search in Google Scholar as well. Another is personal records. So some people write historical and personal records like diaries, that may provide the information you need. And last would be your mass media. These reports published in newspapers, in magazines, on the internet, and so on may be another good source of data. So let's proceed on problems with using data from secondary sources. So when using data from secondary sources, you need to be carefully, as there may be certain problems in terms of the availability as well as the format and quality of data. The extent of these problems varies from source to source. So while using such data, some issues you should keep in mind are, of course, number one, you have the validity and reliability. So the validity of information may vary from source to source. So for example, information obtained from a census is likely to be more valid and reliable than that obtained from most personal diaries. Another one is personal bias. So the use of information from personal diaries, newspapers, and magazines may have the problem of personal bias, as these writers are likely to exhibit less rigorousness and objectivity than one would expect in research reports. Another is through availability of data. It is common for beginning researchers to assume that the required data will be available, but you cannot and should not make this assumption. Therefore, it is important to make sure that the required data is available before you proceed further with your study. And last but not be the least is your format. For the format, problems may arise here because before deciding to use data from secondary sources, it is equally important to ascertain that the data is available in the required format. For example, you might need to analyze age in the categories like 23, 33, 34, 34, 48, and so on. But in your choice, age may be categorized as 21 to 24, 25 to 29, and so on. So this is one way. It depends upon the format. So these are the problems now when using secondary sources in getting your data. Okay, we will discuss on pre-testing a research instrument. So having constructed your research instrument, whether an interview schedule or a questionnaire, it is important that you test it out before using it for actual data collection. So pre-testing a research instrument entails a critical examination of the understanding of each question and its meaning as understood by a respondent. So a pre-test should be carried out under actual field conditions and on a group of people similar to your study population. So the purpose is not to collect data but to identify problems that the potential respondents might have in either understanding or interpreting a question. So your aim is to identify if there are problems in understanding the way a question has been worded, the appropriateness of the meaning it communicates, whether different responders or respondents interpret a question differently, as to establish whether their interpretation is different to what you were trying to convey. So if there are also problems that you need to re-examine the wording to make it clearer and ambiguous. Let's proceed on prerequisites for data collection. So before you start obtaining information from potential respondents, it is imperative that you make sure of their number one, we have motivation to share the required information. So it is essential for respondents to be willing to share information with you. So you should make every effort to motivate them by explaining clearly and in simple terms the objectives and relevance of the study, either at the time of the interview or in the covering letter accompanying the questionnaire and or through the interactive statements in the questionnaire. So you need to ask now and the willingness of your respondents to participate. But again, do not force them to join. So they have the right also to not to join. So it really relevance that you need to indicate the purpose or your objectives why you conduct this study. And another is the clear understanding of the question. So respondents must understand what is expected of them in the questions. If respondents do not understand a question clearly, the response given may be either wrong or irrelevant or makes no sense. That's why understanding of the question is really important for specifically for the respondents so that they can answer also correctly and clearly. And the last would be is the possession of the required information, meaning the third prerequisite is that respondents must have the information sought. This is of particular importance when you are seeking factual or technical information. So if respondents do not have the required information, then they cannot provide it. So that's why it's really important that these are the prerequisites for data collection. So that ends our discussion, and then listen to the next topic for the next module, which is it talks about questionnaire. What is questionnaire all about? Okay, thank you and have a great day. Thank you for listening.